Hello, welcome to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast. My name is Ijeoma Popoola, and you can call me IJ. I will be your host. On this podcast, we'll be talking about the stigma individuals with special needs face on a day-to-day basis on the continent of Africa. We'll be bringing to you professionals in the disability field, sharing resources and information that can benefit any educator, parent, caregiver, and community with persons with disabilities. Join me on this journey in spreading hope and resilience as we advocate for inclusive education on the beautiful continent of Africa. Hello, good afternoon, and this is IJ Popoola with Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast, and I'm here with Mirna Nel to talk about inclusive education in South Africa. Thank you, Ms. Mirna, and thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it, all the way from South Africa. Yay.
It's my big pleasure and honor. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Mirna, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do, just so that the listeners and the viewers could find out more about who you are.
Thank you very much. Well, at the moment, I am the Deputy Dean for Research and Innovation at the Faculty of Humanities at Northwest University in South Africa. But I have a diverse background. I studied as a speech therapist, was a speech therapist for a few years, and then, was appointed at the university as a lecturer, and then as a professor and as a researcher. So I've got quite a diverse background in different fields.
Oh, amazing. So you were a speech therapist. That was your first introduction into special education. Wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
How was that for you in South Africa when you started?
It's interesting because I, was a speech therapist in the education department during the apartheid years and also during the transformation. So it was quite an interesting period for me, and of course, a amazing learning experience.
Wow.
So I worked in a segregated environment, education environment, and then became part of the transformed department, where, of course, inclusivity became a very important issue.
Wow, that's amazing. I would love to go back with that because you emphasized the segregated years and then the transformative years. Amazing. So you are doing research, and I know that from my research, and probably you have way more experience in research. I'm just starting in this. We know that there are a few educators on the continent of Africa who are in special education. So to have a speech therapist back then in those segregated years and now is amazing. So why did you choose this field? Is this something that you kind of stumbled upon or you started and then you continued and loved and has brought you where you are now?
So I most of the time says the field chose me, actually. When I was at school and I had to choose what to study, I didn't know. And my mother was a teacher and I just said, I don't want to become a teacher. And then I got selected for studying speech therapy, which was, it was wonderful because, they only chose very few people to study it. And quite interesting, there were certain requirements that you had to have mathematics and sciences. Yeah, all those kinds of subjects. And I didn't have those subjects. I had biology and that was that. So that's why I say, and I got then selected to study the course. So in a way, it chose me. But then, of course, I got a bursary from the education department. So the education department had support officers. And if you have a bursary, they place you wherever you are needed. So I started working in the support offices at different schools, of course. Yes, and that was quite interesting because it gave you quite a wide variety of disabilities, that you got exposed to. It wasn't, just working or specializing in a certain disability, which was for me amazing experience. Yeah.
Oh,
But
wow.
I need to say, that was after the transformation, we got many, many more schools because, of course, then we got all the Black schools also to work at. So we didn't, then it was too difficult to do really individual therapy. We became more like consultants and, go to schools and support teachers, which was nice for me. I enjoyed that tremendously because, I at a stage just, realized that sitting doing therapy from 8 o'clock until 4 o'clock wasn't really my dream. So the changes was, exposed to so many new ways of doing things and understanding and looking at things, which was for me very exciting.
Wow. And so you ended up getting into research with inclusive education. I almost want to say that's your sweet spot, inclusive education.
You know what, because we have 11 official languages and of course different dialects and different languages, and because of my speech therapy background, my interest was really very much in languages because, suddenly most of our schools were teaching in English, which is basically all of our second language.
Wow.
And of course, learners were experiencing a lot of barriers, and teachers also, because, suddenly I need to learn and teach in English. So, I started inviting people doing workshops, and then I met someone at the university, and she put me in contact with an open position. I applied, and then this position was specifically to train pre-service teachers on barriers to learning, different disabilities, and inclusive education.
Wow, that's amazing. There's so much to unpack there, but I'm going to try to stick to my questions because my mind is just blown with all the questions that are like circulating in my head. So my other question for you is, if you could give the listeners and viewers a context of what it means to be a student in South Africa living with disabilities, because it's obviously different around the world. And I started this podcast because I want to give a worldview of some of our challenges. I can speak on Nigeria, but you have experience in South Africa. What does it mean to be a student living with disabilities? A real picture in South Africa.
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking the real picture. There are a lot of teachers, there are a lot of people in education fields who deeply care about our learners with disabilities, from early age until university age. But the reality is that there's still, even if we have, and we will talk about our inclusive policy a bit later on, we have, I always say wherever I speak about inclusive education in South Africa, we really have some of the most wonderful policies. But in reality, those policies are not really implemented or applied. So unfortunately, even if there's a lot of, let me rather call it sympathy for children with disabilities, there's still a lot of segregation. Unfortunately, a lot of our students are still in special schools or special classes. Very few of them are in mainstream schools. So even though the government says they must get equal education, the reality is that they are still seen as separate from mainstream, if I can term it like that.
Wow, that's some of my questions that I was thinking about too is even in Nigeria, we have special schools. And I feel that with special schools, it's almost like, well, at least you have something, at least you can put the children somewhere. However, that is not the definition of inclusion.
No, it is unfortunately not.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, maybe go to your other questions.
Yes, I know. So, you could talk about that. Well, we could segue into South Africa's policy on inclusion. And for you to explain to us and the listeners what the Education White Paper 6 is. I thought that was an interesting title, but you would know more about it. What is that for us to understand?
Well, that is our policy on inclusive education.
Nice.
Yeah, look, of course, after 1994, when our country became a democratic country, the biggest issue in our country was segregation.
Yes.
So there were a lot of investigations, task teams, and draft papers, policy papers on what is going on in education in South Africa. And of course, it was not just, let me start with children with disabilities. When they started investigating, they realized that there are hundreds and thousands of children with disabilities who are not in any education system. They're not in mainstream schools, they're not in special schools, they're simply at home. Or they in informal care centres, where parents, a lot of parents came together and say, but listen, let's take care of our children with disabilities. And then, of course, we had separate education departments for all the different races in our country, for Black children, for white children, for Indian children, for coloured children. So White Paper 6 said, listen, we need to have one integrated education system. Of course, where there's a diversity in the classrooms. And if I talk about, because inclusion for me is not just about children with disabilities, it is actually about diversity and diverse needs. And we mustn't forget that.
Yes.
So in a classroom, there are, of course, children from different races, backgrounds, cultures, languages, religions, and then, of course, different disabilities on different levels. So yes, that's why White Paper was introduced in 2001 to say we need one integrated system where all children are in education, in a classroom, where they get equal teaching, equal support. Yes, on different. White Paper 6 mentions different levels of support. They will call it your mainstream support, your moderate level, and then, of course, your more intensive needs.
Oh, wow.
Yes. I see you want to ask a question.
Yes, I know. I always have questions. Like people say that you can see the questions on my face. So I'm glad you said that, because my next question was going to be the diversity in learning. And I love what you also said, that inclusion is diversity of everyone, low, high income,
yes.
Have disability, no disability, equal education for every child and adult from primary school to high school and university. And I love that you said that. So my other question was the inclusive learner and the diversity, like what it looks like in South Africa regarding the mild, moderate disabilities and the severe, profound disabilities. So if a student has, severe, profound disabilities, are there resources and infrastructure there to meet those needs? Do we even have special educators? And how many special educators do we have? Are our general mainstream educators trained to work with all levels of disabilities in South Africa?
Okay, those are many questions.
Yes. You can take it one bite at a time.
Okay, let me start with, because I talked about the different levels that White Paper 6 introduced. So White Paper 6 then also said we need to have different schools, which is quite ironic, because on the one side it says we need one integrated education system, but we still have different schools. Okay. So we have what we call our mainstream ordinary schools, where the barriers or learners with barriers to learning are, your basic learning difficulties. And then we have what we call full service schools. So full service schools are supposed to accommodate learners with any kind of need from different levels. But you know, they what they do with full service schools, the district office will come to a primary school and then give them a letter and say, you are now a full service school. But the reality is that most of those teachers in those schools are mainstream trained, so they've got a general B.Ed degree, or they have a degree in in secondary education with a specific postgraduate certificate in education. So they don't have specific training in special education. But the sad reality is also that these schools still have classrooms with a large number of learners. You know, our average classroom numbers, and you have it in Nigeria also. I talk about, you know, in our foundation phase, which is grade R to grade 3 or year 1 to 3, you know, where there are learners of 50, 60 in a classroom. So now in that classroom, you will have learners with autism or Down syndrome or ADHD, you know, those kinds of disabilities. But you will also have special classes at these schools. And even the special classes will have numbers up to 40. So it sounds, if you look at the policy on full service schools, the idea around that is wonderful because the focus is to integrate learners, have these different kinds of abilities and disabilities in one school and in one classroom. But yeah, the reality around it is a bit more difficult. And then we have special schools. So we will have specialized schools for learners with hearing problems, with visual problems, with physical disabilities. And then we of course, also have schools for children with profound and severe disabilities. So yeah, if you hear what I'm saying, is that you know, I mean, the government has worked very hard to make sure that all children is in a classroom.
Yes.
But there's still segregation in how they deal with disabilities. Unfortunately.
Right. So in an ideal world, like you said, we and I'm learning that too as a researcher, is everything is not all bad. There's some good, you know, and we, like you said, we talk about the transformative years and how it is better. The progress might be slow, but at least we're moving slowly in the right direction. Maybe we might take one step back, but we keep going forward. So in an ideal world, you know, what should, and I think you said it, but just to reiterate, what should inclusion of diversity of students with or without disabilities, what should it look like to really create a nation that will value, you know, every student, whether they're with or without disabilities? Like, what should it look like if South Africa were to be a template for us to follow?
So can I tell you my dream?
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
My ideal, based on the policies that we actually have in our country. And there will be different people that will absolutely disagree with me, people who work with children with disabilities, that will also say, but we need to have separate schools still for children, especially with children with severe and profound disabilities. My ideal world is that teachers know how to deal. As I said earlier, inclusion for me is a social issue also.
Yes.
So the ideal is that we have these diverse classes where there are different kinds of learning needs and, of course, different social backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different languages, different religions, different cultures, where people are seen as different, but not accepted as different. And what I mean by, I always say my definition about inclusive education is actually to respect, accommodate. I'm very careful to use the word tolerate Because tolerate is used in many books, that we tolerate differences. But that doesn't always say that you respect differences.
Yes.
So that is a contentious term for me. But that you accept, listen, I cannot look the same as everyone. I cannot live the same as everyone. I cannot speak the same language or believe the same thing. But that is okay. We are different, but learn from each other. Because if we don't learn and listen from each other, we're never going to accept each other.
Yeah.
I mean, what's going on all over the world, where people get angry about differences. If you don't think the same as me or believe or say the same things as me, sometimes you are discriminated against or worse. Yeah. So so the real world, the reality or the ideal world for me is where we actually sit in the same room, same classroom, same school, saying, but listen, even if we have the same, if we are the same race, we are different. But let's learn from that. Let's absolutely respect each other and accept each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So for me, and especially disabilities, they're always seen as someone different. In the olden days, before inclusive education was accepted or seen as important, I grew up in a world where children who were in special schools or special classes were seen as crazy. The crazy children.
Yes.
Yeah.
And labels.
Oh, yeah, don't get me talking about labeling. Yes. And unfortunately, in most of our communities and societies, that's still, the kind of attitude. If you're in a special class or a special school, you are seen as abnormal. I always ask my students, what is normal actually? Who of us are actually really normal? Yeah, so that's a whole philosophical debate.
It is.
So I mean, I can talk for hours about this. So let me just stop there, and then maybe you can ask me something.
Okay. No, I really appreciate that, and I really value a lot of your responses. While you were talking and with some of my research, I realized that South Africa, again, looking at some of the progress that we've made, was one of the probably first countries to adopt the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is good. That was something that most African nations could now aspire for. And then we have the adoption of its own policies back in South Africa. So if we just talk a little bit about the cultural barriers, with Nigeria, we have, like you said, our own stigma, and we have our labels, and we have our cultural connotations, which might not necessarily be good. And I find that every day is a learning process, and us academic warriors, I call us, we're trying to change the narrative, one person at a time, one family at a time. How is it for families who have children with disabilities in South Africa? Is income an issue in terms of getting that help, those resources? How is it? Because I do have to say, to a certain extent, South Africa seems to be, doing a little better in that area compared to other African nations, but how is it with that in terms of getting that access to resources and help and support local government level?
Have you been to South Africa?
I want to come.
Okay, please come. I mean, despite all our problems, we are really a wonderful
really want
country,
to come.
Beautiful country.
I really want to come.
As soon as traveling opens, I will invite you to come and visit us.
Oh, okay.
No, definitely. we definitely need to do that. So please let COVID now get out of the way so that we can just see each other again.
Yes. It is on my bucket list, and yeah, I mean, we can talk about it more, but I really want to do a lot of good work with students with disabilities on the continent of Africa, with some of the things that I do on the side. You know, like I have a business, and I try to have some of those proceeds help people, family with disabilities in Nigeria, because like you said, the profession chose me. I was going in another direction, and I substitute, you know, we can segue into the conversation later, but I substitute taught in a class, never have been in a special education class before. And it was such an eye-opening experience. And the students just gravitated towards me. I gravitated towards them. And I think for me, I only taught for a year, but every single time I walked into my class, they had so much love in my room. Like the students were so loving and so respectful, and knew more about daily living skills than even children without disabilities, you know? And I thought it was so fascinating. But I would sit there and I would be so haunted with the fact that, why don't we have this in Africa? Like I would go in there every single time I learned something or I went through training. I was like, why don't we have this in Africa? Why is this taking so long? And so I just shifted my focus, and that's why I'm here right now in this process. So that was a little bit of a digression, but it chose me, and I haven't been able to, and I'm so glad that this is what I feel I've been called to do.
Oh, okay. Now we definitely need to have a longer conversation about your life also.
Yes. It's long. Oh yeah, I had my degrees in something else, international human relations, but I've been able to tie it into my doc degree. So it's been good. It's been good.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Now I definitely want to hear about that.
Okay, no problem. So the cultural stigma and labels in South Africa, what do you think?
I mean, we have a big country. So we have very rural areas, and then we have, of course, our urban areas. And most of our schools, or our special schools for disabilities, are, of course, more in the urban areas. So in the rural areas, yes, there are still, it's not so much anymore, but it's still the stigma about, if I get a child with a disability, you know, it's a curse. You know, I did something wrong and now I got this child with a disability. So in some of our far rural areas, we still have that stigma, unfortunately. Yeah, but Johan, I'm making an assumption here. I don't think it's so much in South Africa as such as in some other African countries, you know, if I read the literature and some of the research. But the sad thing is that many of these children, of course, I mean, many of our rural children walk kilometers far to get to any school. Yes, you know, so then many of these children, well, if they're small, sometimes there are these parents that start these care centers, but they take care of them. There's not really education. Many of these children we call them, they are included by default because they go to the nearest school, which is many times a mainstream school. And these teachers are not always prepared to teach these children. Because of the different challenges, because they sit with large classrooms, there are not enough resources, you know, so I'm always very careful. There's a lot of research that judge teachers, but I'm always very careful to judge our teachers because they don't have, or, you know, it's not the easiest to be a teacher in South Africa. And then we have, you know, in our cities, we have our specialized schools and our special schools, and our schools who are, of course, much more resourced, and they have smaller classes, so, you know, and they have parents that can actually afford to put their children there, and wonderful things happen at these schools. But if we go to our, I'm sure you know that we still have because of apartheid, the township areas, where basically most of our Black people live, which is right next to our cities. But in many of those townships, there are a lot of poverty, of course, so a lot of schools, parents who cannot afford proper education for their children. So there's still a lot of disparity. We have well-resourced, wonderful schools, which have children from all races and cultures. But then, of course, we still have our schools which is really not well-resourced. A lot of poverty in the area. Children, parents who cannot really afford to, education. Education is important for them, but it's not a priority because survival is important for them, So, of course, we have a lot of children who are school age and who should be in schools who are not in schools. A lot of our children leave school at 15, 16 years old. And there's not really work for all of them.
For everybody.
And sadly, a lot of our children with disabilities are exactly those children. So yes, there are very good things, and then there are things that's very upsetting still.
Yeah. So teachers are a very important element to the success of the implementation of inclusive education. And like you said, being a teacher in South Africa, it's very difficult. It's challenging here in the States too, but when you compare some of those support systems on the continent of Africa, it's hard. If a teacher, hasn't been paid, again, in those rural areas, if they don't get, enough income to take care of themselves, it almost seems like an added burden. And those are the disparities that we talk about in our continent as developing in certain areas. So what do you think are those barriers to, quality training and professional development for all teachers? Will we ever get to a point where those teachers in the rural areas ever have some kind of training in special education? Are there systems in place for that?
You know what? I don't think it's a reality in South Africa. Look, in the past, we had teacher colleges, where teachers could specialize in their fourth year in special education or in disabilities. And of course, our teacher colleges closed down quite a few years ago. And so all teacher education is now done at universities. Okay. So our teacher education has improved tremendously. The quality and the standard really has improved tremendously. I mean, we have teacher education policies in place now with really high requirements, So our teachers in general are very well trained at our different universities.
It's amazing.
But they do not have, at very few universities, they have the choice to have subjects in special education or learner support. We actually want to look. White Paper 6 also emphasized that we actually should not talk about special education anymore. Or children with special needs. I always say to my students also, what we do if we talk about labels also to children who have special needs is we tell them, you're so special. And that's why you're going to the special class or special school. But the fact of the matter is everyone is special. Every child is special.
Every child is special.
Yeah, so sorry, I regress a bit also now,
True.
But yes, because we have this policy on inclusive education, our teacher education focuses on training teachers in general. Of course, in the different school phases and then subject specialists also. Our policy says that, all teachers must be trained on how to support learners who experience barriers to learning. We rather talk about barriers to learning and special needs.
Mm-hmm.
So teachers need to be trained on how to deal with diversity in the classroom and how to support learners who have specific barriers to learning. But the reality is that most of our teacher educators, our lecturers, are also don't have a background in teaching learners with disabilities.
Yeah.
So it's always, we always talk also about this additional approach. So most of our teachers, our students, our teacher educators will see special education or inclusive education as this separate issue. So you have subjects in your teacher education who, 3 or 4 modules, semester modules or year modules, who teaches you about inclusive education, who teaches you about barriers to learning, but it doesn't really give you the skills on how to teach children with disabilities.
Yeah.
So many of our students, because their hearts are in it, that's always an attitude also that most teachers will say, but listen, I cannot do this. I cannot teach children with disabilities. Some will be honest enough to say, but it scares me a little bit. And then we have students or teachers like you who step into a special class of children with disabilities and just say, but listen, this is me. This is where I want to be.
Yeah.
So those teachers will go into special schools and learn, have in-service learning on how to teach children with disabilities, yes.
Yeah. Hi. Hey, they can make a cameo. We're okay with that. We're inclusive.
Working from home, it's cats and it's small children and everything else.
That's okay. So would you say that you have enough special education teachers in the special schools, or?
No, we don't. Even in our special schools, we still have classes with large number of learners. So no, I think definitely, my basic belief is that all teachers need to be trained in dealing with all kinds of learners, disabilities. Even if they don't teach those learners in the end, it's important for teachers to understand, but these are just learners who have a disability. They are not crazy or they are not the disabled. So that is important for me. But we definitely do not have enough teachers at the moment to teach our children with disabilities, yes.
Okay. I know we just, like you said, it's when we talk about it and it sounds, very sad, but it's the reality. And I think if we can look at the reality, we can paint a different picture. I'm of the belief that if, many parts of, the continent of Africa really see our educational system as, like you said, those transformative years, I think each nation needs to get to that inflection point where our education system is not serving everybody. And I know that we have done things that are kind of like, putting the Band-Aid on and it's patchwork. But, we have to be visionaries, at some point and see, okay, what do we want for the future of our nation, and paint a different picture. And it seems a lot, but it's okay to if we do it right at the foundation, then the people to come will do it better and we'll keep building on a good foundation. But if we just keep, working on the top level and just, putting whatever things on top, it doesn't serve us for the future, is what I think.
Yeah. Look, you need to have a vision. You need to be visionary also. But I think sometimes that's where our biggest problem is that, and that's where many of us working in the field of inclusive education at the moment is really despondent. Because when inclusive education became a policy and we started doing research, we really got so excited about all the possibilities and how we're going to transform everything. And now, we are at a stage that we feel, listen, but we have all this research. We had many conversations and conferences. We brought people together from all fields. From government, from the top level at government. Teachers, community, societies, and we. At the moment, we feel every time we have that conference, we start the conversation from the beginning, because then people will say, but let's look at the practice. We stand in front, and I mean, I'm guilty also, because my students will also say to me, you are preaching to us these wonderful things about inclusion, but this is the reality. It's not happening in the classroom. And that has been the talk also for many, many years, that we have these visions, we have these missions, we have these wonderful policies, but it's not working in practice at the moment. We go on as always.
Right. And it might be safe to say, with you saying that, is, how successful, has South Africa and some of our other neighboring African nations, how successful have they been in implementing inclusive education? And I thought of something the other day. I was watching a conference, and they had, specialists and professionals talking to parents and other special education, directors and professionals in that field on things surrounding autism and, all those good things, which are good, for people to know how to live and work with children with disabilities or special needs. But I couldn't but help to think that, we didn't have education on that platform. We didn't have education on, okay, so how do we actually include these children in school? And like you said, a lot of nations still have those special schools. And I just find myself kind of torn between a rock and a hard place, because, I have a lot of friends who are directors of special schools, but there's really no learning, and it's no fault of their own. It's no fault of the parents. They'll rather be there than be on the street or rejected. But there's no learning, and I think that was my passion in that. Okay, how can education be part of this conversation of how to work with children and adults with disabilities on every level?
Look, you know what? In the early years, also before transformation, special education or children's special classes were basically taught life skills. So I remember, even when I worked as a speech therapist, children in special education classes were learned how to do woodwork, needlework, cooking, those kinds of things, because there was a general belief that they cannot be educated.
Yeah, wow.
So this is the one great thing that happened with our policies and with the change in our education system. There were these visionaries that said, but listen, all these children can be educated. They can learn how to read and write. They can actually work and be successful people outside of this protected environment of special education. So that has changed a lot. Of course, there's still, the old beliefs are still there in many people. So there are, from government side, and there are a lot of private organizations and disability organizations who worked really very hard to make sure that children with disabilities get good education. So unfortunately, I talk about these pockets of excellence because we do have them. If we had conferences also, there are so many teachers and school principals that tell you these wonderful stories about how children with disabilities, you would have in the past been believed that will never achieve anything, became very successful. But I still dream that this will become the general belief,
So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the unrest in South Africa, just looking at the realities. And I wanted to know, did that affect, this is a couple of weeks ago that, everyone saw it on the news. Did that affect, the education system, students without disabilities? How did that, because I think about that, like when I see, those things, like how does it affect the education system?
Yes, of course it does. In the past year and a half, because of COVID, our children were also in and out of schools. It's the same as all over the world. And there of course were quite a lot of online learning, and children that comes from poor areas, online learning is just not a reality for them. So now you have these kinds of situations where there's a lot of violence. And where schools, of course, had to close. Look, fortunately, they did not target schools. So a lot of buildings were burned down, and a lot of workplaces were burned down. But fortunately, in the past, in times of violence, unfortunately, schools also sadly gets burned down. But during this violence, at least the schools did not get directly attacked by these people. But during those times, the schools were closed down. So because it was not safe and children couldn't get to these schools. And now we have COVID, who prevented children going to school for many, many weeks during these last 2 years. And then you've got this added challenges of these things happening and keeping children out of schools.
Oh, wow. So on a brighter, lighter note, it does, tug on my heart when I think about the realities. And I think, when I contact and connect with other professionals in that field, it's just good to see that there are people there. There needs to be more conversation about it, more brought to the forefront in our nations. But what parting words of wisdom and just anything you think that we could probably do in South Africa, on the continent of Africa, to, just be more inclusive? I love, what you said, that inclusion for you is about respect of differences, and who says your normal is the normal, and, one thing I would say to people when I talk to them about, my students who have disabilities is, why do they have to fit into your world? Why are you so nervous to go into theirs? And when we really appreciate each other's differences, you'll see that there is so much more. There's just so much more, to just people in general, and who we are and what we are supposed to contribute. And even if we have the same skin color, we're still going to be very different in how we think and how we interact. So how do we appreciate those differences? And I think that would be kind of one of my last questions for the interview.
We definitely need continuous conversations, but very open and honest conversations, because I think there's still, our country's still very young in our democracy, so there's still a lot of awkwardness and uncomfortableness around differences, not just about disabilities, but race, cultures. But the one thing that I do find and that I really believe brought about changes is simply having conversations, being open to listening, not to force what you think and you believe, onto someone else. But because unfortunately that still happens, someone, and I don't want to see that, because you simply get people who are so passionate about talking about all these things that happened to them, which was wrong, these things were wrong. That they're still not open to listening.
Mm-hmm.
I always, with my young students who actually grew up after apartheid, they will always come to me and say, but my parents talk about all the difficulties that they experienced. Yeah. So, and then sometimes they get impatient with all these, how do I say, all these moans and groans about the past. But then I said, but you need to understand. Look, the one sad thing is that people want to deny history.
Mm-hmm.
So they would say, oh, listen, this happened in the past, it's over and gone, let's look at the future. And that is very important. But we still need to learn so much from history and what we did wrong. And I think for us, it will still take quite a lot of years. A lot has changed. It's amazing for me to see how people accept each other. And, I don't want to say forget differences, but actually look past differences and simply, function as human beings with each other.
Yeah.
But yes, there's still a kind of a awkwardness. I don't know if awkwardness is the right word. It may be a bit of uncertainty, a bit of uncomfortableness about difference. So yes, that's a long answer to actually a simple answer to say, but listen, we need to have open and honest conversations. Yes, listen to each other, be open to learn about differences. Then I really think we will continue on the right track. Because those are the things that have changed things in South Africa, is actually having these kinds of conversations.
Yes, absolutely. And we can't talk about, those open conversations without, even just referencing, the great Nelson Mandela and his contributions to education. Yes. I mean, that's a whole podcast in itself.
If we thought, because if I write an article or chapter, I will always use his quote about education changing the world.
Yes.
So it's very sad that he couldn't have been longer with us.
Yes, I know. We wish that he was around to really see, just what the things that he's done, his sacrifices, and really see it, to fruition in South Africa. And I really truly believe, when we think about education, I look at your university, like I was looking at your university that you work in, and I said, wow, this is South Africa. Some people don't know that is there. Like, this is in Africa. That's huge. And it should be like that, in other parts of the world. Really having a lot of us, because we left Nigeria to go to America and other places in Europe for an education. But if we had our educational systems, again, that's a whole different podcast, but, just where it needs to be, those things would have happened. So, well, my other question for you is, I know that you're a researcher and you head your department there, actually, and, not to brag about you, what you do is a big deal. Do you have any new research that you're thinking about that you could, probably just talk about a little bit? I enjoy hearing. It's like good food for me.
You know what? Yeah, because I maybe you heard in the beginning, I'm in a management position now, so my research is really. It's. I made the choice to take this position because there's changes that I needed to make.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, my research at the moment is standing a bit still.
Okay.
We had big projects working specifically on changing teacher education courses to be, to train all our students in inclusive education.
Amazing.
So many of those projects are now, we're done with them. But I belong to, at our university, we have research entities where, all staff members belong to these research entities, and these entities help people just to focus their research.
Wow.
And I belong to this wonderful research entity in our faculty called Optentia, which is very multidisciplinary. So it has industrial psychologists, clinical psychologists, nurses, social workers, people from risk management and sociology. So quite a different multidisciplinary entity. And now we got a PhD approved in inclusive practices and in organizational psychology and inclusive practices. So I'm moving more out of education because I was in the Faculty of Education, and now, as you would have, I'm in the Faculty of Humanities. So it's two different faculties at our university. So of course, the education background for me is still, that's still my passion. But my focus is now more on working with colleagues in this entity, looking at inclusion in different kinds of places, workplaces, schools, universities. So that is now, because inclusion in general is, that's my passion.
That's amazing, and that's so necessary. Wow. Thank you so much, Mirna, for being on the show and sharing your knowledge and understanding. And I love what you said about painting a real picture with everything, the good things and the things that are not working so well, on our continent. And, for the listeners who, like me, who have not been to South Africa and who would love to go, if you send me an invitation, I am coming. Where are some of the places that are maybe not necessarily touristy, but what would you recommend, if I were to come to South Africa, where would you recommend I go, and what food would you recommend that I eat?
That we are called the Rainbow Nation, because we've got this absolute diverse cultures, and diverse foods in our country. Yeah. Of course, you need to see Cape Town, the beautiful Cape Town area, the Western Cape. You need to go to a game reserve. Now, of course, the Kruger Park is our biggest game reserve, and it's always wonderful to go there.
Wow.
But we have very different ones that you need to visit. But I think it's important, if you come to South Africa, just to see a bit. It's not possible in a short visit, but to see the differences in our country, because we have the Cape Town area. We've got mountains, we've got forests, we've got wonderful beaches, we've got these desert areas.
Wow.
Yeah, so you need to see the nature, and of course you need to experience the vibrance of our cities also.
Yes.
So wild animals, non-negotiable.
Definitely.
Especially if you're coming from Africa, that's just a must to see.
It's a must-see.
And because we've got this wonderful parks in our country, there's so many opportunities. And I think you've also got that experience that especially European people will ask you, are the animals still walking in the streets?
Yeah, definitely.
And then we will laugh. But sometimes, our wild animals actually do escape from our parks, and then they do walk in the street.
Walk on the street. They absolutely do. They escape and they walk. I know we have some of that. It's actually interesting. Well, do you live with, the animals? And you're like, oh, okay. No, that's interesting. And I know that we're based out of Germany, and I know that the Dutch language is still in South Africa, which is amazing. And it's definitely something that, people need to see how diverse South Africa is and is becoming. And I'm really grateful that you are such a positive influence in this field. I mean, what you're doing with inclusion. I've been so encouraged and blessed by this interview, and definitely, a contact that I would love to stay, in touch with and stay connected with you, Mirna. Thank you so much.
That will be wonderful. Yes. Please.
Thank you.
No.
Thanks for listening to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast this week. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so on our website at www.ijpopoola.com. Or if you want to write to us about topics you would love to hear covered on the show, the email address is popoloijeoma@gmail.com, one word. And if you'd like to follow us on our social media pages, it's at Miss IJ's Kids. I am IJ Popoola, and you've listened to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast.